if you're a team of architects, if you're a funder, a philanthropist who wants to put into the pot that makes the, the more generous the prize is, the more likely we are to get really good entries. So if you have funds, please donate to the project. The money is for the winners. This is a planetary redemption project, which is like so many of the other things my institute is doing. And it comes from this intention to transform the current fear-based system that we have, based on militarism. Militarism is premised on defence, and defence is there, we need it because of fear. If we take a step in the direction of love, which is the whole question of love studies that I've proposed as a field we should be working with, we move beyond fear. We move to compassion, altruism, love, and we take a risk, if you want. When Leonardo da Vinci died, just before he died, he cried. When I went to the room and studied his life story, I discovered this. He died with tears in his eyes, and the king asked him why was he crying. He'd just taken communion. He was a faithful Catholic to the end, in the sense of a genuine universalist Christian, which is what a true Catholic is. I was amazed at, I once had a talk to a Protestant policeman from Belfast. He didn't really, he never had explained to him what the word Catholic meant. He'd fought Catholics on the streets of Belfast. He hated Catholics. He thought it was just like a sort of a name. He didn't know it actually meant universalists, which is what it actually means. Somebody that thinks universally outside the box and for the benefit of all mankind. So no wonder people are fighting in places like Northern Ireland when the proper explanation is never given them of what these concepts mean. But anyway, there's Leonardo, faithful universalist to the end. He's taking communion and he's crying. He's dying. The king's there. There's a famous painting of this scene, by the way. And the king says, why are you crying, Leonardo? And he says, I've done so little with my life. He's produced masterpieces in various media. He's influenced whole future generations of thinkers and artists. And yet he's crying because he knows that compared to what he could have done, he's done so little. This I call the Leonardo, tear, the tears of Leonardo. We should all cry those because we're all here on the job now on planet Earth at a critical time of the need of this planet. We're surrounded by fellow citizens. We should be working together on projects like this Leonardo da Vinci Prize, not going off and working for the military-industrial complex, which has its academic wing. Most scientific departments in academia, are plugged into the military-industrial complex. What I'm saying is let's develop a peace-industrial complex. The Nonagon can be one of its epicenters, which would then make funding available for peace projects, peace studies, peace research globally. Every university in the world should have a department of peace studies, in my view, that would look at peace within its own lineage and tradition. So, University of Edinburgh, Glasgow, they would look at the history of the Scottish peace movement, of people in Scotland that have worked for genuine peace and reconciliation over the centuries. And, there's a long and ancient history of peacemaking in Scotland. I've just lived there for 7 years, going back to Columba and before that to the ancient Druids of Scotland, who the Druid is sworn to peace and non-violence, right? In Dublin University, again, a Department of Peace Studies would look at the contributions of Irish thought, whether it's ancient Celtic or Catholic Christian or later forms of philosophical thinking around peace. Huge history there. But the same in universities in Medina or Jerusalem or New York or Beijing. Peace is multi-textured. It's about creating the mosaic of humanity as something beautiful, getting all the beautiful pieces in place, right? The word mosaic means the work of the muses. The word mosaic actually comes from the etymology of the same word as muse, and it meant the opus museus was the mosaic is the work of the muses. And I think that peacemaking, this is why I invoke the Nine Muses as the guardian of my institute, because peacemaking is a work of the muses. It's bigger than any one person can do. We need 100 Leonardos on the job. We need Hypatias, we need female philosophers, we need the great minds of all history to come back now, to reincarnate on this planet now, and to, to finish off the perfection of this work of humanity, which can only be done with peace. It can't be done with militarism. The only other solution is more wars, more conflict, and more theologies that say ours is the best religion, we are going to conquer everyone else. That's childish thinking. The beauty of the Renaissance and what Leonardo stood for is that it outgrew that thinking. It realised that every system of thought, every philosophical system has its own beauty and can be contributing to the overall wisdom of the planet. Now, I want to share a little thing here about that, because it's interesting. At the time of the Renaissance, there was a rebirth, as I've said, of ancient philosophy. I want to end on this philosophical note. This is from a very important work by D.P. Walker, who was a great historian of ideas, called The Ancient Theology, Studies in Christian Platonism from the 15th to the 18th century. And he talks about 16th century France, which is where Leonardo da Vinci came to live. And he says there are two types of Christianity that were in vogue at that time. Firstly, there was the illiberal kind. And this was the traditional orthodox churchianity that said the Jewish revelation was the only pre-Christian one. All the pagans were damned to hell just for having been born in paganism times. And all their acts, including their thoughts and writings, were sinful and worthless. Now, this is a position that St. Augustine sometimes seems to point towards. St. Augustine, in his book, The City of God, which has probably got the wrong name, with all due respect, seems to be saying, if you read it, that only Christians will ever be saved and go to heaven, and that all the pagans that predated Christ are evil and worthless and sinners. Now, Augustine was brought up a Manichaean, that is, someone that believed in absolute dualism of light and dark. So this is a Manichaean thinking. And with all due respect, if I was meeting Augustine, I'd say the guy needs therapy. I come from an entirely different lineage of Druid Christian Neoplatonism, which is a Hermetic-inspired, visionary position, which would agree with Pelagius that instead of the pagans being sinful, they themselves had wisdom. Anyway, this was the illiberal position. It also argued that everything in the Bible is true. Everything. Nothing Hermetic not in the Bible is true. So the Bible is 100% true, all everything, and nothing outside the Bible is true. However, some things in Augustine might be true. This is D.P. Walker's summing up of the illiberal position, which was held by you could be very learned, you could know your Bible inside out in Latin and Greek and French and whatever. You could know Augustine's works, which are very voluminous and take a lifetime to study. But you could hold that position, right? This position didn't like the Jews, because it regarded them as having been superseded. It didn't like the Muslims, because they're all heretics. It didn't like the pagans, because they're all precursors to Christ and were damned. So all it liked was the good Catholics, right? And unfortunately, this was held by a lot of thinkers at the time. These are the kind of people that had gone on a massacre of the Cathars only a couple of centuries before, and had taken 100,000 men down the Rhone Valley to Béziers and slaughtered the Cathar castle at Montségur and the others, killing hundreds of thousands of people in the most cruel and brutal ways, because they were the wrong kind of Christians. They were heretics. And that thinking, the illiberal one, is what underlay all the militarism of the Middle Ages, which unfortunately hasn't died away. That's kind of the thinking of the Pentagon at its worst, which is everyone who's not with us is a heretic, we can bomb them all whenever we want. And it's interesting that, that illiberality, the word liberal has now become dangerous in Washington or America. If you're accused of being a liberal, that's like, seriously, you're in danger of being locked up. Well, that's very interesting, isn't it? Because the word liberal originally meant a learned person, a person of freedom, liberale, who intellectually has risen above this kind of literalism and ignorance. Okay, so reclaim the word liberal in its better sense. Now let's look at what liberals believed in 16th century France. Well, the Gentiles, the pagans, as well as the Jews, were being prepared for the Christian revelation. They were part of the build-up, right? They were the warm-up act, but they were extremely important. They had themselves partial revelations, and they reached God by natural reason. So they had access to ultimate truth as well, and they might have learnt some of these from the Mosaic tradition without realising it. Some people speculated that the Hermetic wisdom of ancient Egypt had been partly learned from Moses. There's a lot of thinking at the time of the Renaissance. Where did the Hermetic scriptures come from? Surely they came from the same place as Moses. Probably it was the other way round. Moses got a lot of his wisdom from the ancient Egyptian pre-Mosaic wisdom. And a book, the Moses Code, I think a film as well, goes into this, that Moses was learned in the arts of the Egyptians. That means he studied Egyptian theology. And the Egyptians had reached monotheism. The Hermetic texts are monotheistic, but they're comfortable with polytheism. You can be both if you are a Hermetic thinker, because, in mathematics, you need the number 1, but you need every other number as well. You can't think mathematically without all these numbers, including 0, which came later. So if we're going to be truly scientific about theology, we need all the numbers. So I'm a monotheist, I'm also a dualist, and a Trinitarian, and a polytheist, because I'm a mathematician with spirituality. That was the insight, I think, of the liberals during the Renaissance, of which Leonardo was an exemplar. He was in love with mathematics, of course, because he was a Pythagorean. So the liberals would say, well, many of these precursors to Christianity were themselves saved. It's not fair to have them all damned, as the illiberals would say, just because they predated Christ. And also, the whole of religious truth is not plainly shown forth in the Bible, because many parts of the Bible are contradictory, many are rather unpalatable ethically. Some of the things that are said there are rather, they're very bad to women, they're very bad to, alternative thinkers, and we can realise, and several hundred years of biblical scholarship since the Renaissance has realised that these texts are very clouded by the culture of the people who wrote them. And although there was divine inspiration coming sometimes into them, there was also a lot of prejudice and layers of demonization at work. So valuable, indeed essential help can be gained from non-canonical writers, both Christian and pagan. That was the liberal view at the time of the Renaissance. So Leonardo's library contained, many esoteric texts and so on, as in the library of Florence at the Academy, and as does my own library. And this is why I've been working on commentaries on things like the books of Enoch, the Gospels of Thomas and Mary Magdalene, because as a liberal, in both the philosophical sense but also the political sense, I believe that human beings are entitled to knowledge, to gnosis, to wisdom, and that the duty of educators like myself is to give it to people. We have a duty, a moral duty, to raise the quotient of intelligence in the community as a whole, that more of us can realise this liberal enlightenment. We don't then have to fight over each other's respective revelations. We can honour and respect them, and we can study them. So things like the Interfaith Peace Treaty come from that. And so would the Nonagon. That would be its starting point. And I'm going to end there. I sincerely pray from the bottom of my heart that you will join and help this project, join my institute, work with me in whatever country you are, to get this Nonagon built on top of the Pentagon. And if I don't achieve that during my lifetime, I'm going to cry on my deathbed and really, be very upset. So please don't let me have Leonardo's tears on my deathbed. help me build the Nonagon. Okay? Thank you so much.